Hello, everybody. Ken Coates speaking on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Welcome to our seminar, Renouncing the Doctrine of Discovery. You're in for a real treat today. We've got a wonderful panel of people to talk about an issue of compelling importance. For generations, Indigenous people in this country have rejected categorically the whole idea of the doctrine of discovery, a statement of the Roman Catholic Church that was used to justify the European occupation of Indigenous lands. In 2003, the Vatican has renounced the doctrine. And this webinar looks at a couple of questions. Why were Indigenous people opposed to this Catholic doctrine? Why did the church move away from it in 2023? And what's the significance? What does this mean for Indigenous legal rights, political rights, sort of social rights? Delighted to be joined here today by two absolutely superb panelists, Dr. Bruce McIver, an author and one of Canada's foremost Indigenous lawyers. I'll introduce him in more detail shortly. And Dr. Michael Higgins, a prominent Catholic public intellectual and author. We're really delighted to have both of you with us today. Bruce is a partner in a company called First Nations Law LLP, one of the most innovative and important Indigenous law firms in the country. I followed Bruce's work for many, many years. And if you look at the kinds of things he's doing with Indigenous people across the country, he's one of these folks committed to rebuilding Canada in a more just and more equitable manner. And fascinating to watch the work that the communities he's working with, of how they're trying to press the envelope on sort of Canadian jurisprudence and doing some wonderful things. But Bruce is a remarkable individual known for his high principles and his commitment to Indigenous folks. Bruce's ancestors actually took Métis script in Red River in Manitoba. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from Brandon University. He has a PhD in Aboriginal and Environmental Law, was a Fulbright scholar, has a law degree, and is the author of a wonderful book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. It's called Standoff, Why Reconciliation Fails Indigenous Peoples and How to Fix It. It is a wonderful combination of good thoughtful policy and a gut-wrenching sort of introduction to how Indigenous people see these matters playing out in their own lives. A very important thing to read. Michael W. Higgins is a Basilian Distinguished Fellow in Contemporary Catholic Thought from St. Michael's College, University of Toronto. He's got a wonderful background. You've probably seen him on television a lot. He talks a lot about papal affairs on CTV and on CBC. When he wasn't doing all this kind of stuff, he was president of 3 different universities: St. Jerome's University in Waterloo, St. Thomas University in Fredericton, and was a vice president for Mission and Catholic Identity at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. He's got a wonderful track record as a scholar, as a thinker, and as a writer, and a public intellectual. And he's working right now on several books about the current Pope and the manner in which the Pope is revolutionizing. That's my word, Michael, not yours. Revolutionizing the Catholic Church. Some would say modernizing. Some would say attacking its very foundations. But perhaps you'll talk to you a little bit about that. It's a wonderful, perceptive insights onto this very important Pope. So we're going to start today, just so everybody knows the format. Bruce and Michael are going to open with their opening comments, and they'll speak for a few minutes. I've then got a whole series of moderated questions that I'm going to ask them back and forth. We've received questions from members of the audience already. We invite you to enter any questions you have as they emerge in the conversation. Enter them into the chat. If we have an opportunity, we'll use them as we proceed. And as we always do at these webinars, we promise to end on time. So we will be finished at the top of the hour. So we're about to get going. Bruce McIver, I'd like to ask you, please, to your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks for the invite. It's an honor to be taking part in this and with Michael. I wanted just to start by talking about why is any of this important? I get questions all the time. Who cares? This is hundreds of years old. The Catholic Church has said a long time ago that the papal bulls that are referred to aren't actually enforced. So who really cares about this? Why should we care about this? And we all should, as Canadians. We should care because the papal bulls and the doctrine that we're talking about here underpin property law in Canada. They underpin the very basis of the Canadian state. We don't talk about it in Canada much. I'm a lawyer. I go to court a lot. You don't talk about the doctrine as much. Instead, we do a very Canadian thing. We have a Canadian euphemism for the doctrine. We call it the assertion of crown sovereignty. If you do a search on the case law in Canada, you'll find that coming up hundreds of times. Basically, it's this idea that's infused and supported by the doctrine. The intellectual basis were the papal bulls. The idea that colonizers can just show up, assert control, assert a property interest in Indigenous land, and make decisions about those lands. That idea is fundamental to the Canadian state. When we hear about the duty to consult, what is that based on? It's based on the assertion of crown sovereignty, i.e., it's based on the doctrine of discovery. When we see Indigenous land defenders, the Wet'suwet'en, standing up to defend their lands, to say, no, you can't build a pipeline across our lands, what are they responding to? They're responding to the doctrine of discovery, because that's the basis that the provincial governments across the country will say, yes, we get to decide. We get to decide to put that pipeline through. So when you see the RCMP with their attack dogs facing off largely against Indigenous women defending their land, you're watching the doctrine of discovery in action. This is not a historical issue. This is a present day issue. And so that's why it's so important for Canadians to engage on this, not as a historical relic, not simply as a teaching of the Catholic Church, but instead as the fundamental basis for power and control in Canada over Indigenous lands. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Really appreciate that frank and direct sort of analysis as we were hoping for. Michael, please, your opening statement.
Already raised. There is a lovely passage by James Baldwin, the well-known Afro-American writer, which I think is particularly pertinent to our discussion today, but also to the larger issue of the discovery doctrine itself. And it was James Baldwin's advice to white people when he said, go back where you started, as far back as you can, examine all of it, and travel your road again, and tell the truth about it. But it does seem to me that what James Baldwin was saying to white America is in no small part the discussion around the discovery doctrine in the context of Canada. What does it mean? What does it actually mean? What are its implications? What is the nature of its authority and this kind of thing? I was struck in relation to this to Phil Fontaine's response when the joint statement came out recently from the American bishops and the Canadian Catholic bishops in relation to a joint statement by the Vatican in March of 2023. Phil Fontaine said that the Church has done one thing, as it said it would do for the Holy Father. Now the ball is in the court of governments, the United States and in Canada, but particularly in the United States, where the doctrine is embedded in the law. The Vatican's response of 2023 took me actually a bit by surprise. And I had to, I cover the Vatican for various publications, and I actually didn't see this coming. I thought that the Vatican had resolved the matter in 2010, and then again in 2016, and then with the Pope's own comments on the plane flying back to Rome. So I was surprised that another document came out in which the Church once again asserts that it has abrogated, rescinded, and revoked the teaching of Pope Alexander VI, the Spanish Borgia Pope, in 1493. So the Vatican's response is a very interesting one. It's a very short one, but as interesting is the response of the Canadian and American bishops. And it's very rare, by the way, that Episcopal conferences would have a trans-border or extraterritorial alliance around a particular issue. And clearly they have here. The American Catholic bishops are as concerned about the issue as the Canadian Catholic bishops. And they have spoken about invoking the Pontifical Commission for Historical Sciences, which is part of a large apparatus operating within the Vatican, to create a symposium and to draw on historians, particularly historians, lawyers as well, I suspect, to look more clearly at what the discovery doctrine means and its larger implications. So it is time to move forward on this issue and not find ourselves in any kind of fractious debate around the pertinence of a 15th century document that has been repeatedly abrogated. But obviously, there's something in that doctrine or in the political, geopolitical mentality, current and previous, which doesn't allow it to be so easily exercised. So what are we to do about this? But anyway, this is the latest developments. I applaud them. But I was, again, as I said earlier, a little surprised at the Vatican response. The joint statement, I should say, comes from two dicasteries. Dicasteries are kind of cabinet offices operating within the Roman Curia, or the governance structure. One is the Dicastery for Integral Human Development, and the prefect or the head of that is a Canadian Jesuit by the name of Michael Czerny, and he has a long history of active social justice concerns. He did his doctorate at the University of Chicago. He was in El Salvador shortly after the assassination of the Jesuits at the university there, and then he ran the most successful AIDS network in the entire continent of Africa before his appointment to Rome. He's very close to the Pope, and he shares very much these fundamental constitutive social justice concerns. The other is the Dicastery for Culture and Education, and the Pope recently appointed Jose Tolentino Mendoza. He's a Portuguese intellectual and cardinal who brings a wealth of material and comparatively young, in his early 50s, whereas Czerny is in his mid to late 70s. But both of them have issued this joint document at the request of the Pope. So I think we're in a relatively good position to carry on with deeper reflection on the implications of the doctrine. And personally, I applaud the Vatican's initiative on this matter.
So, Michael, thank you very much. You've both given very provocative introductions and backgrounds to sort of how this issue is important. And we've got ourselves about 45 minutes to sort of dissect it further and make more sense of it. And that'll not do justice to the complexity of the issue. But Bruce, let me go back to you. You've thrown down a rather impressive intellectual gauntlet. You make the argument, and it's a good one, that the Doctrine of Discovery was the foundation for European sovereignty, claims to lands in North America and elsewhere. How does the repudiation of the doctrine challenge or change the legal foundations of Canadian sovereignty? Speak to the technical part of this. Has anything really changed?
Well, I think the repudiation of the doctrine by the church itself isn't going to have a legal effect. That's not the question. It has a moral effect. It hopefully has a moral effect. Michael referred to James Baldwin and truth-telling. I was surprised too by the Vatican statement. I was surprised how innocuous it was. I was surprised from my own perspective how self-serving it was, because I didn't see a lot of truth-telling there. The way I read the statement from the Vatican was that, these colonizing nations took our words, took our papal bulls, and they misinterpreted and misapplied them. And so it's not really our fault. It's those colonizing nations that misapplied our teachings. I think that was disingenuous. I think it's really important to keep in mind that the Catholic Church itself has been benefiting from the doctrine for hundreds of years, continues to benefit from the doctrine. I think what would have been really important, not just the truth telling, but the action. And this is where we need to go. We need the Catholic Church and all churches to step up and say, we're doing something. We're doing something tangible. If the Vatican would have said, and this is what we expect politicians to do, we're going to set the example. We're going to get involved in land back. We're going to do something meaningful here. And we expect these colonizing nations now to do the same. I think that would have been a lot more powerful and a lot more truth telling.
So, Michael, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that since I can see you're itching to do so. But I make a contextual comment here to say what Bruce has just said is very, very similar to the comment from a lot of Indigenous leaders after the apology about residential schools, where the apology was made, but there's a whole bunch of unresolved issues in terms of the actions of the Roman Catholic Church, access to records, financial compensation, the use of reparations, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of people said the same kind of thing. So just to push it back to you, Michael, sort of how do you respond to Bruce's observation in the context, not just of the Doctrine of Discovery, but also other apologies the Catholic Church has been involved with recently?
Oh, this is a book length response you're throwing at me here, Ken, but I'll see what I can say in the context of some of the things that Bruce was just talking about. I disagree with Bruce. I don't think the document is disingenuous. I do think the document is rather limited, though, and perhaps we have some agreement on that. There is a failure often in ecclesiastical parlance, not just emanating from the Tiber, which often distinguishes between the church and some members of the church, or the government of some particular national sovereignty and the role of the church. It's a form of exculpation which is undesirable. But at the same time, independent of how these documents are crafted, we need to look at the fact that the Vatican has once again specifically given Pope Francis's return from his penitential pilgrimage to Canada. And we can argue about its various merits and the consequences. Nonetheless, these dicasterial heads, who are not insignificant thinkers in their own right, working with appropriate bodies, crafted a document that surprised Bruce and surprised me by the fact that it was even necessary, surprised Bruce by its inadequacy. Nonetheless, it is a response specifically to concerns that originated among Indigenous peoples in Canada regarding the authenticity and sustainability of the Church's repudiation of this so-called doctrine. Now, it really gets very complicated because it's also a matter of the use of language. It isn't actually a doctrine. It is a position that was taken in a papal bull in 1493 by a Spanish Borgia Pope attempting to negotiate in favor of his native country, Spain, over against Portugal in relation to the new lands being discovered in the Americas. The document was formally repudiated several times by subsequent popes in subsequent documents. If a different pope had been in the position, say Paul III instead of Alexander VI, perhaps this discussion wouldn't even have occurred. This is not to understate the implications of the discovery teaching or the statement that occurred in that 1493 document. It's to put it within its appropriate historical context. We attach far more significance to it than I think it merits, and that's where the problem comes. If you have sparring partners or people taking strong moral positions on this, and one party says, well, wait a minute, this document has long since lost its validity, and it lost its validity as a consequence of its revocation by subsequent popes. Why is that the centerpiece of this? Are we not attaching more importance to it, way out of proportion to its significance? I don't question in the least, and we have a tragic history that provides the empirical evidence of what happens when conquerors and kings and monarchs of whatever iteration begin their conquering of native lands, indigenous lands. They loot, their rapaciousness is without question and whatnot. Obviously, they're going to invoke as much authority as they possibly can. And the Vatican court in the late 15th century is very different from the Vatican court during the Caesaro-Papist period, when popes were significant players on the political scene. By the late 15th century, they are significantly weakened in relation to that, and with only a couple of generations, there would be the Reformation itself. So I think it is important to keep in mind the historical context, not to diminish our moral responsibility, but to frame it properly.
Thanks, Michael. So Bruce, change the questions just a little bit. We've heard a few observations from Indigenous leaders about the repudiation, about the position that the Pope has taken on this issue. I want you to characterize how Indigenous peoples are reacting to this now. We haven't seen all that much publicly, but I also want you to you've hinted at this a bit in your opening statement. How should the government of Canada and how should the provinces and territories respond to actually underscore the significance of this, which you both agree to in somewhat different ways? You both agree this is a very significant event, but how should they respond to that from the government side? First question is, how should what are Indigenous people saying about this? Second thing, how should governments react to this?
Sure, thanks, Ken. So I'm not here to speak on behalf of Indigenous people, of course, but I can lend a bit of context and based on the work that I do and the law. So the first point on this about what's the significance, it's not the papal bulls themselves, it's that these papal bulls then were based on, like Michael said, they were used as the intellectual basis to develop the law in North America on how colonizers could claim the land. So that is what we're talking about with the doctrine itself. That becomes a legal principle based on the papal bulls, which basically set out European nations can claim the land because the land now is held by a bunch of savages. They're uncivilized, so Portugal, Spain, and so forth can take the land. That becomes the doctrine. In 1823, it's 200 years ago now, of the U.S. Supreme Court McIntosh decision. That's where the legal doctrine comes from. And then that gets imported into Canadian law in the late 19th century. So that becomes part of Canadian law. And then when the Supreme Court starts looking at Section 35 of the Constitution, where do they go to? They go to those U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And they basically say, no one's ever disputed the right of the crown over the land based on that doctrine. So that's why it's fundamental. Your question about the so-called apology, Ken, I think that's really important. And that was one of the things that I was concerned about when I saw the Vatican's statement, because what can happen is these so-called apologies can be weaponized against Indigenous people. It can end up being a situation where those that have apologized basically say, what are you complaining about? We apologized. Move on. It's time to move on. And then the third point, Ken, is about what can we do? We need to have this truth telling now in Canada. I'm really disappointed the federal government is doing its action plan on implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There's nothing in there about engaging on the doctrine and how that's a fundamental aspect of Canadian law. So what can we do? We can start with the truth telling around that in a real concrete way. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really interesting set of observations about the importance of truth telling and figure out where they go. I'm sure that somewhere in the Department of Justice, there's a coterie of lawyers sitting down to telling the politicians, don't you dare apologize anymore. Don't you say anything, because it's, following Bruce's logic, and it's a very strong one, you're attacking the very foundations upon which Canada's use of all land is, and its allocation of land, private property, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm sure that there's a bunch of legal technicians advising the government not to get too far ahead of itself. And what Bruce is saying is, not necessarily they should jump up and change the world overnight, but you start by telling the truth about what's actually going on. And Michael, to sort of pick up on that in a slightly different direction, it seems to me that the Catholic Church has, whether it's been completely successful or not is an issue for your observations and comments, really making a real concerted effort toward reconciliation. This Pope in particular feels it's a really serious sort of obligation. So what impact have those measures had on the Catholic Church? We can talk about it on society as a whole. One of the things that always strikes me as a counterbalance to our thoughts about the church is, when the Pope was here, thousands upon thousands of Indigenous people came to see him. This is not; these are very prayerful people. They're committed Catholics. They're not repudiating the Catholic Church, even though they're recognizing the horrible things that were done in the name of the Catholic Church over many, many years. So what's the motivation behind the Catholic Church getting involved with these very unique, not uniquely Canadian things, but very powerfully Canadian things? And how's that working out within the Catholic Church? Has it really been internalized at all the different levels of the church, or is there still the Pope trying to clear the air and trying to get traction?
That's a very good question, and it's quite layered in many ways. Let me just begin by building a little bit on what Bruce said, because I think he's right, and specifically in relation to the notion of asserting sovereignty into some of these discussions coming from national governments. This is not, again, to exculpate the Church's responsibility, but it is to contextualize it. The bulls that were referred to, and I'll move quickly beyond that, but it helps to put in context Pope Francis's role in this. The bulls that we were talking about are really two of them issued by Nicholas V and one by Alexander VI. Subsequent popes nulled and voided these documents. They were all abrogated, and by the time Paul III issues his Sublimis Demus, and Dominican theologians, Vittoria, Montesino, and more personally de las Casas, already had made very compelling cases in the early 16th century as to the right, the dominium, as it was called, of the indigenous peoples to their property. That it shouldn't have been confiscated, that the settlers, they wouldn't have used that language, but the conquistadores were wrong. We're acting inappropriately. So there is a strong, but it's a minority history. It's a minority voice, as it often happens in the Catholic Church. But it's more authentically connected, it seems to me, to the prophetic dimensions of the gospel than very often the institutional position which attempts to consolidate its power. So there is a long history, by the way, and I don't have time to go through all of this, in which the papacy does assert the human rights of Indigenous peoples again and again and again. Is it listened to? Not. You will remember quite some time ago a wonderful film done in the 1980s with Jeremy Irons playing this Jesuit priest called The Mission, about the Guarani and the fights between the Portuguese and the Spanish, and the Vatican sending over its envoy. What eventually happens? They remove the Society of Jesus. The pressure on Pope Clement from the Spanish and the Portuguese monarchs is so great that the Vatican collapses, caves in. This happens not infrequently. Come into the context of the current period. Francis is deeply concerned about the history of the Church's failure institutionally in relation to Indigenous peoples. We have already had quoted on several occasions his intervention in Bolivia in 2015, but there have been several since, and there were many by his predecessors, most particularly John Paul II. How effective are they is a different matter. You got to remember, in the complex nature of the Roman Catholic Church, head office is on the Tiber. Okay. Each bishop in his own diocese is a corporation soul. This is the kind of language Bruce can fully appreciate. They're the financial and they are the legal reality. They run their diocese, or can, as private fiefdoms. the Pope's overarching responsibility can sometimes be significantly diminished by resistance from national episcopal conferences or individual bishops who don't like what the Pope says. They can stonewall, they can do all kinds of different things. So how does the Roman Catholic Church under Pope Francis, and we're going to contextualize, make this very specific, how does it move forward in the area of reconciliation and reparations that are meaningful? Well, in a recent conversation the Pope gave, and this Pope is very prone to scrums and private interviews or on the airplane, unscripted, drives his aides or assistants crazy because they can't control the narrative as a consequence. He was talking about returning some of the materials, the objets d'art, that are in the Vatican museums that were given as gifts in the 19th century, but nonetheless, they were given by people who perhaps didn't have the right to give them as gifts because they were already lifted from the local indigenous culture. And he says we need to return them. And we need to return things that we have stolen. Okay, he says this on the interview when he's flying back from Budapest. Now, he's just gone to Hungary to talk to Orban to try to make a case for Hungary not to block migrants, but not to be tied so closely to the Putin regime. So he's already engaged in some kind of political, social justice activity on that front. As he's coming back, the question of indigenous artifacts being returned surfaces, and he talks about the fact you don't steal from people. Well, in many ways, the crowned heads of Europe stole from the people of the indigenous lands of North America or Turtle Islands. So how do you begin the process of effectively correcting that history, accepting moral responsibility, moving beyond self-justifications and denials, or what most happens, and I suspect that this is the most frustrating things, not only for Indigenous leaders and Indigenous people in Canada, but many other supporters, the fact that we set up yet another commission, set up yet another court case, set up yet another formal inquiry, and we just stall. Well, there is a moral consequence of stalling. And it does seem to be that Francis is a pope that doesn't like to stall. How it moves through, trickles through national hierarchies is a different matter. And that's where those questions need to be addressed more pointedly, not so much in terms of the Vatican. Vatican sets the general pattern and direction. How it's implemented is a matter of national episcopal responsibility.
Yeah. Which always shows the difficulty of moving forward, and you can change the agenda, change the language, don't necessarily change the practice, which is sort of your main point. My frustration with that, Michael, which I'm sure you'd agree with, certainly consistent with what you just said, is that when we delay things on the Indigenous file, Indigenous people pay a direct price.
Yes, they do.
A direct price in terms of sustained poverty, systematic discrimination, all these kinds of things.
That's
you
right.
don't, unless you actually change things practically, you haven't really changed things very much. And the communities continue to suffer, which is sort of the huge problem going forward. Bruce, both you and Michael have been talking extensively about the role of history. So you're one of these unusual lawyers who has a PhD in history and a very solid understanding of historical process and historical realities. So if you go back not so far, back for 30, 40 years, the teaching of history was a unifying force for the country. People taught you'll remember this, J.R.M. Lower from Colony to Nation. It was about the sort of Whig interpretation of how Canada came to be a great nation. And we see the same pattern in other sorts of countries. Now we see a process where the history that you're talking about and the history that Michael's talking about is the exposure of shortcomings, the real weaknesses, real tragedies, real evils, illegal acts and things of that sort. So how do you reconcile these? Is there a different role for history going forward? Is history only going to be this truth-telling of uncovering the weaknesses in the past? Or is there some way in which we can make that a more powerful and unifying force for a better Canada?
Yeah, I think that sort of truth-telling through history is vitally important and in itself can be a unifying force for Canada. It's something that Canadians should be proud of and should be doing more of. I remember taking these types of history courses 30 years ago, and there was often a contrast made between Canadian history and American history. And basically the idea is, well, maybe Canada didn't treat Indigenous people that well, but look, the Americans did it even worse. And I think that type of narrative needs to be unpacked. We need truth telling about that. Then we can have a solid way forward. I don't really accept it when I hear people say, don't be shedding a light on these things, because look, what's going to happen to the national identity? If it's a national identity based on a lie, based on a fiction, if it's a national identity that's actually weaponized against Indigenous people, I don't think we want that national identity. I think we are a stronger country than that, and would be a stronger country if there was more truth telling. The point about what do you do, I think we get focused too much on what the Vatican said and the papal bulls. And okay, one of the things I think is positive here, the Vatican said what it did. Let's put the focus back on not just the federal and provincial governments, but what individuals are doing in Canada. What are people doing? I appeared on the CBC about this a few weeks ago. The next day, I had several calls from people. What can we do? We want to give land back. From several churches phoning me. None of them were Catholic, that's fine. But they were phoning me, what can we do? And I think that's really important. Let's have that conversation. Let's have individuals, let's have congregations stepping up and taking responsibility. And when I get asked, what can they do? I always say, well, there's two main things. Ensure that the Indigenous people whose lands you are on benefit from those lands. A lot of churches across the country are redeveloping their so-called lands, and they're profiting from it. Indigenous people should be able to benefit from those lands because it is their land. And second, Indigenous people should be involved in the decisions about those lands. If you can do that as a congregation, I think you're making an important contribution. Thanks.
No, great ideas. And it's really interesting watching how this is working out differentially across Canada, where you have some jurisdictions that are actually moving fairly nicely in the direction you've described. We actually see a lot of this going on in the Yukon, for example, where those conversations are kind of front and center. Same in the Northwest Territories. Some cities, North Vancouver and West Vancouver, interestingly, working with the Squamish and with the Musqueam, and actually had very blunt conversations along exactly the same lines. And I guess, Michael, I'm going to turn this question a little bit back to you, but to give you a chance to sort of talk about the constructive things that are happening in the Catholic Church. I mean, it seems to me that the criticisms are real and they're really important. Uncovering the past is a responsibility for all of us. But I think the other sort of part of this is realizing that people are doing things on the ground. One of my favorite books is a book by Paul Hawkins called Blessed Unrest, talking about climate change and how to moderate climate change. And his basic observation is it starts at the community level. Don't wait for the governments to set targets or international organizations to have Paris Accords. Actually, what do you do in your own backyard that really matters? And it's the aggregation of 100,000 acts of contrition and opportunity that actually make a difference. So, Michael, give us a bit of a sense of how this language, the debate around doctrines of discovery, apologies, renouncements, and things like that are actually playing out on the ground, if you could.
That's a very good point, actually. And, Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator, used that marvelous phrase, conscientization. Once you become aware of something, you cannot cease to be unaware of it. You can't block it out, right? So when people are conscientized, it's an awkward word, I admit, and even more awkward in English. But when they become aware of something for the first time, it can be quite disturbing, quite arresting, quite liberating, and they can't unknow that, right? So it seems to me that the process of conscientization around Indigenous issues in Canada is ongoing, and that there are many particular instances of positive signs. I want to give just a couple. There is a Squamish deacon in North Vancouver who is a member of the Catholic Aboriginal Council. And he has been very critical in having the liturgy or worship translated into Squamish so that people can celebrate in their own language. This is a very significant development, and you might think, well, it's fairly minor. Weren't the Jesuits doing it with the Algonquin and the Huron centuries ago? No, this is and there is some truth in that, but this is specific in this context in North Vancouver. There's another one at the other end of the country that I'm aware of, a priest by the name of Bill Burke, who is a former member of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops in his capacity as Secretary for Liturgy, in which he's working with Member 2, just outside of Sydney, which is where the Mi'kmaq have a marvelous undertaking, entrepreneurial, historical, communal, and whatnot. And he is part of their life. He shares in their worship life, but he also shares in their social justice concerns. And he's a principal spokesperson outside the Indigenous. He doesn't presume to appropriate their voice, but he's there as a companion along the way. This is classic Pope Francis language, right? So in concrete empirical terms, there are many examples across the country at the local level. Whether they receive the kind of support at the diocesan level, that will depend on diocese. You've got people like Don Boland of Regina, who's a national leader. And you have other bishops who seemed sadly unaware of the consequences of past behavior and unprepared to make any kind of change in course direction. And some of this is, again, in relation to some of the issues around clerical sex abuse, residential problems, where bishops have paid more attention not to their pastors and their ethicists, but to their lawyers. How do you control this? We don't want this narrative getting out of control. We're going to find ourselves in a position of compensation, litigation, liability, and what's it going to do for the future of the church? There's a narrowness in that perspective because you can find the church to its holdings. What is its land? What are its buildings? What is its apparatus, structure apparatus? Pope Francis talks, and he did at the very beginning of his pontificate. From the very moment of his pontificate, he talked about wanting a church of the poor for the poor. All right? So it seems to be a very significant papal direction. Now, many bishops, and certainly by no means exclusively Canadian, I worked in the States for 10 years, so I'm not unfamiliar with the American hierarchy, would be quite reluctant to begin the process of divestment, of moving toward a more gospel-focused Franciscan understanding of witness and dissolving the structures of control in order to enter into the life empathically, to enter into the life of the victims and survivors. But there are bishops who are doing it. Cardinal McIlroy of San Diego, Cardinal Sykes in the south of Texas, Brownsville, I think it is. They're doing incredible work along this line. So there are institutional examples, clerical examples, and a number of lay examples, which I have not mentioned, but which are in fact even greater in number, that are attempting to move beyond conscientization to the next level of implementation and action on the ground.
Yeah, very encouraging, Michael. Very good to hear that. And it's interesting, Bruce is involved with the front lines of this. There are hundreds of Indigenous communities that are sort of facing the consequences of this, pushing back at the same time, and trying to find common cause. And quite frankly, looking for allies wherever they can find them in many, many instances. So, Bruce, I can't remember the first time that in your writings or in your observations, I heard you talking directly about the Doctrine of Discovery, but I know it's been there for a long time. But until recently, most Canadians had never even heard of the concept and certainly hadn't internalized it, and more importantly, had never taken any collective responsibility for it. So what happened that made this into such a prominent issue? Is this a situation where you need a major non-Indigenous institution like the Roman Catholic Church, like Pope Francis to actually take an action for the country to pay attention. What always frustrates me is Indigenous people have been talking about this for generations without getting much traction. So what happened recently to give this power and authority?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Ken. From my perspective, it was the inaction of the Pope. When the Pope visited Canada a couple of years ago, of course, Indigenous people had this at the forefront of what they wanted the Pope to engage on. I was surprised the Pope didn't seem better prepared for that. But through the strength and determination of Indigenous people all across the country, bringing it to the forefront, that's where I think it became part of the wider public consciousness. I remember doing several interviews at Globe and Mail and CBC at the time and having reporters express to me their surprise that this had become such a national issue. And I think it was the Pope's unwillingness at the time to make a direct, clear apology on Indigenous land that led to that consciousness. Indigenous people have been raising this not just publicly, but in courts, and in the 2014 Silcoteen decision from the Supreme Court, the first declaration of Aboriginal title in Canada. Indigenous people participating in that appeal made extremely strong arguments about the doctrine and about the need for the court to say something useful on this front. Basically, the court just sidestepped it. The court said, well, we don't think it really applies. I don't think anyone who has done a lot of work in this, at least myself, think that that's correct. It does apply. It's very important. And just that statement from the court at the time really, again, energized Indigenous people all across the country. So I think fundamentally, this is another example of Indigenous people, their persistence, their strength, continuing to speak truth, and finally, a wider segment of the non-Indigenous population starting to listen.
Yeah, starting to listen. And as Michael's talked about himself, it takes a long time for these things to percolate through, but I'm going to keep reinforcing the point. When it takes time, you just double down on the consequences, negative consequences for Indigenous folks. So time is actually benefits the powerful people, not the ones who are sort of exposed in that regard. So Michael, an interesting question from one of our audience members, Eric. Why does the Catholic Church get singled out as an actor in this respect? It sounds as though you're treating the Catholic Church like a sovereign. In terms of polity, Canada's been under the British monarchy since Confederation, and actually before then. And the church leadership in the United Kingdom were not Catholics. So why are we not having the Anglican Church repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery, or the United Church, or the Episcopalians, or whatever it is you want, right? Why is the Catholic Church getting picked on, Michael?
Well, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has been involved in actually some significant initiative in relation to the issue around slavery that's going to result in something like £100 million and creating quite a stir in the Anglican Church in terms of compensation, support, and reparations and whatnot. So it is not exclusively a concern of the Roman Catholic Church, of course. The Roman Catholic Church is always hit harder by the media and others simply by virtue of its size. It's the longest standing institution. It's a actual universal institution that has a huge apparatus, has its own ambassadors, for heaven's sakes. It's very different in kind than most other Christian churches, or indeed many other religions. As a consequence, it is often held to a different standard that can sometimes, I think, be perceived as unfair. I just want to respond to something that Bruce said, because I think it's important that I provide some clarity from my perspective on this. The Pope's quandary, as it might be called, in terms of the discovery doctrine, why didn't he talk about it when he was in Canada, is not the result of papal incompetence or the failure of his advisors. His unfamiliarity with that doctrine, or its nomenclature, could be largely attributed to the fact that he wasn't appropriately briefed by his hosts. This would have been the responsibility of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, not the Vatican per se. It is, to me, puzzling, and I've written about this. I've written about this in Commonweal magazine in New York and elsewhere, including the Globe and Mail, that it is startling to me that the media was unaware, and other leaders, both Indigenous, religious, and secular, the public leaders, were unaware of the work that has been done on this. That in 2010, for instance, the permanent Vatican mission to the United Nations, Archbishop Cesare Melori, delivered an official document in relation to the repudiation of the discovery doctrine and outlined it, and so talked specifically about some of those legal developments that Bruce was referring to earlier in terms of 19th century American jurisprudence and even mid-20th century or late 20th century jurisprudence with Ginsburg. And then the Commission for Justice and Faith, which is a committee of experts working at the Conference of Catholic Bishops in Canada, issued a very, very detailed document signed off by some Indigenous leaders across Canada, including, as I said earlier, the Aboriginal Catholic Council, providing a very good historical backdrop to this, and nobody seemed to be aware of this. So the failure to communicate the information that had been done, which again, I have to say, does not exculpate, it's not self-justificatory, it's an effort to put within historical context the reasons why these developed and the responsibility of the Church in relation to them. That information did not seem to be disseminated. Journalists did seem to be blithely unaware of it. Bishops themselves seemed rarely to refer to it. And then when the Pope is flying back to Italy, somebody asks him on the plane about it. And then he confesses to some puzzlement about it because he's not heard the term. And then, at least in English, you got to remember he's Spanish, he's Argentinian, he responds by saying, well, if this is what it is, if it's about colonization and it's about now of course we repudiate it. So it does seem to me that this was a missed opportunity, and it should have occurred on Canadian soil. But I don't blame the Pope for this omission.
Thanks very much, Michael. We're down to the last sort of less than 10 minutes to go, and I'm going to give you each 1 minute at the end to sort of do a final comment if you wish.
Okay.
There's a question to you, if I could. One of the questions from our audience members. How do we understand the role of the treaties? And I'm assuming this means both historical and modern treaties, where the whole question of sovereignty is clearly passed to the Crown, and Native peoples acknowledge the sovereignty of the Crown in return for the treaties. Does that take the Doctrine of Discovery sort of out of the question, out of the conversation? In other words, it's been dealt with?
Not at all. I don't see the treaties. I have a lot of treaty clients. I don't see the treaties as acknowledging the sovereignty of the Crown. I don't know where that comes from. My treaty clients across Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and elsewhere, they see it as a partnership, and that partnership has been disrespected and broken. The treaties aren't about giving up interest in the land. The treaties aren't about giving up decision-making over the land. That's a complete misconception. We see it recently in Alberta and Saskatchewan with the legislation that's been introduced. We see it with the effect of the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement on the prairies. So that's not what the treaties are about. And so the doctrine is just as important in a treaty context. It's important. I talk to people about this all across the country. since the Chilcotin decision in 2014, the number one outstanding issue, I think, in Aboriginal law around Indigenous rights in Canada is this misinterpretation of the so-called historical treaties. They aren't cede and release and surrender treaties. And that's work that needs to be done. And there's a lot of truth telling needs to be done there. Thanks.
And you'll know, Bruce, that there are historians, you among them, who are trying to do that, going through these historical arrangements and making it clear what the First Nations people and even the Métis people sort of had in mind when they signed these things. And it's really instructive for our audience to remember that when the modern treaties got started, we negotiated in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, the conversation for a long time focused on what they called certainty. Government of Canada, we'll sign this document as though you tell us you'll go away and never come back and ask for anything in the future. And First Nations said, on that basis, we won't sign treaties. We're not going to acknowledge certainty and make it a once and for all proposition. And they negotiated ongoing involvement in all the resource development, land use, and everything else sort of requirements in their communities. Michael, a last question for you, and you got about 1 minute to answer it, and I'll give you each 1 minute back and forth. And Michael, mine's very simple. What does the Catholic Church do next? And Christopher, thanks for the question.
I think that the Catholic Church can use its spiritual authority. I mean, we've been talking about its political influence, its political authority, and that has waxed and waned over the centuries. Right now, we have some wonderful examples of the Pope exercising that soft political power, and although it's been controversial, in relation to Beijing and President Xi, but also, more importantly, with Zelensky and with Putin, to try to find some way for the Vatican to insert itself as a mediator for potential peace discussions in the current Ukraine war. Now, that's important, it seems to me, but the primary role of the Vatican is spiritual. And it does seem to be that spiritual authority, grounded particularly in the current pontiff's understanding of mercy, in his understanding of entering into the life of the victim, and very importantly about encounter, his theology of encounter, of being with the people, of listening to the people, of not coming with scripts that have been prepared. And we saw that in more than one instance during his penitential pilgrimage to Canada. He was most successful when he listened. People were generally touched. I've talked to many Indigenous people, including those highly critical of the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church for past sins, who were nonetheless deeply impressed by his authenticity. So that kind of model built around encounter and mercy, those are spiritual realities for sure. But I got to tell you, I mean, many of these issues are not going to be resolved satisfactorily simply on legal or political grounds. There has to be a change of heart. And that's where the Vatican can be an important player.
Michael, that was absolutely wonderful. And I'm going to use that as your last statement because it was such a wonderful, succinct summary. Bruce, you got less than a minute. Just give me your quick takeaways on this.
Sure. I think what this all adds up to is movement across the country for a real day of reckoning. I think that's what's important. I was listening to a podcast last week about Britain dealing with its history of slavery and colonization, coming to terms with that, how the power and wealth of the country is based on that. In a similar context, I think it's time for Canadians to step up and have a day of reckoning about what the power and wealth of this country is based on. And it's based on this doctrine. And when we come to grips with that, find meaningful ways individually as communities to deal with that, I think we'll be in a better place.
Well, Michael and Bruce, we hope for a lively, provocative, and thoughtful sort of conversation. We got all three and more. I really appreciate the background that both of you provided, your calmness in the face of very provocative sort of conversations with each other. The depth of knowledge is really critical. And quite frankly, in the middle of this conversation, I see a more promising future, a possibility of a church really committed to reconciliation and moving in that direction. And as Bruce lays out, the need for the country as a whole to sort of come to that day of reckoning, as you described it, Bruce, where we still play around the edges. I mean, I always think that Canadians think that money is a surrogate for love and affection. and that as long as we're spending money on Indigenous affairs, that we've done our bit. And in fact, the message we get out of this conversation, certainly from Bruce and Michael, also from you, is that money and practical things are not enough. You actually have to rethink the very foundations upon which your society is based. And in a combination of faith and optimism and cross-cultural sort of understanding, build a future together that's actually much better. Michael W. Higgins, you've been wonderful. I appreciate your coming on with us again. It's been fantastic. Bruce McIver, your wonderful, very important insights into this wonderful, wonderful conversation. To the audience members who came, thank you very, very much. I should just note that everything Macdonald-Laurier Institute does, and we have many, many of these webinars on a monthly basis, made possible through our generous donors. And if you enjoyed this event and feel drawn to sort of contribute something, you can go to canadahelps.org and look for Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We really want to make sure that we do provide exactly these kinds of provocative debates that force Canadians to come to terms with the fact that good public policy is the only foundation of a prosperous and successful nation. Michael, thank you again so much. Bruce McIver, thank you. On behalf of Macdonald-Laurier Institute, everybody, thank you for being with us today. Farewell.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Bye-bye, Bruce.